Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the meeting of the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. We're delighted you're here. Our business this morning, we have a fine group of panelists assembled to offer presentations on passenger rail and mobility. And our senior research associate, Chris Belden, who will come on up here, I'm going to yield to you, and you'll introduce our speakers and tell us whatever we need to do or not to do. I will say this, as is my custom, we will wait till the end of the discussion to ask questions. We will not interrupt or ask questions between speakers. We will wait till the end of the meeting to ask questions. So members, if you want, feel free to make some notes or something. All right. And now, you're recognized, Mr. Belden.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners. I am pleased to introduce today's panel on passenger rail and mobility in Tennessee. So if the panelists would like to come up and take their seats. Public Chapters 1114 and 1124, Acts of 2022, direct the Commission to study passenger rail and other transportation alternatives to improve mobility in Tennessee. An update was presented to the Commission at the last meeting in December. Today, you'll hear from 3 panelists who will describe their experiences with establishing, expanding, and maintaining state-supported passenger rail, as well as a panelist from the Tennessee Department of Transportation, who will discuss the department's perspective on passenger rail. The 4 panelists, in the order they'll be presenting, are Julie White, Chair of the Southeast Corridor Commission and Deputy Secretary for Multimodal Transportation at the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Julie will be joining via phone. Next, we have Mike McLaughlin, Chief Operating Officer with the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority. After that, we have Nicole Busich, Vice President for Network Development with Amtrak. And then we have Dan Palme, Assistant Chief of Environment and Planning and the Director of Freight and Logistics at TDOT. Julie White, Mike McLaughlin, and Nicole Busich will all use PowerPoint slides, which can be found behind tab 7 in your docket books. In addition, representatives from Class 1 railroads are in the audience and are available to answer questions if needed. We will present a draft report for your review and comment at the June Commission meeting. I'd like to thank our panelists for working with staff throughout the project and for agreeing to be here today. If there are no other questions for me, I will cede the floor to our panelists.
And Ms. White is starting.
I'm not in the room. Thank you. I apologize for not being able to join you all and being remote, but very much appreciate. Thank you, Chairman, for having me available by phone today and happy to share what we're doing in North Carolina. As they said, I'm Julie White. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Multimodal Transportation at the North Carolina DOT, which in our DOT includes the Rail Division, the Integrated Mobility Division, which is public transit, bicycle, and pedestrian transportation and new mobility. We have our Division of Aviation and our Ferry Division. My team has about 800 employees and about $500 million a year in appropriations. I want to thank Tennessee for their ongoing participation in the Southeast Corridor Commission. Dan Palme and I have been working together through the SEC for a few years now and have had the chance to share with one another what each of our state DOTs are doing in passenger rail, freight rail, transit. He and I spent time talking about your Blue Oval City project, which is so interesting. So appreciate your state's participation in that group. Our states have much in common with our large geography and our mix of rural and urban communities and the challenges of moving our workforces long distances to jobs. So I'm pleased to share with you today our passenger rail program history and what we're looking to in the future. I am talking off my slides, and hopefully we're going to keep it together where you're going to be looking at the same slides I'm looking at. So I will be listening for somebody to say, we're not seeing what you think we're seeing, and somebody stop me if you're not. So hopefully we're advancing to slide 2, and you are seeing the North Carolina Passenger Rail Service Development slide. So interest grew in the 80s to bring passenger rail service back to North Carolina. And in 1990, we introduced the Amtrak Carolinian service between Charlotte and New York, offering the first opportunity for North Carolinians to go all the way through to New York on a state-supported service. You can see how we've grown the program and the introduction of the Piedmont in 1995, which runs between Raleigh and Charlotte. You can see how over the years we've added additional daily round trips on the Piedmont between Raleigh and Charlotte. We have done that. You'll see photos there of our state-owned equipment. We purchased it all used and then refurbished it. Believe it or not, we have purchased 1950s Korean War rail cars and rehabbed them into the program that we use today. They are all operated by Amtrak, and we are now doing 4 round trips a day of the Piedmont and 1 of the Carolinian, and we'll be adding a 5th frequency to the Piedmont this year. You'll see on that slide the North Carolina Railroad Improvement Program and the Piedmont Improvement Program, which were major investments in the corridor that enabled us to add those additional frequencies. And through these programs, our rail team continued to grow and develop further expertise that has us well positioned for the future growth that we are planning. If we now advance to slide 3, it will give you a sense of where our service operates in our state. You can see the Carolinian that goes Charlotte to Raleigh and then through north to Rocky Mount and up to New York. You can see our Piedmont, which goes back and forth between Raleigh and Charlotte. And you can also see the Amtrak long distance service and their thruway bus service. I would note on this slide in Raleigh, we opened Raleigh Union Station in 2018 in partnership with the city of Raleigh. And we're working toward opening Charlotte Gateway Station in 2026 in partnership with Charlotte. Advancing to slide 4, we just announced very recently our record ridership in 2022 with over 500,000 passengers riding our state-supported Amtrak service. We are very excited to find intercity service hitting the sweet spot of travel post-pandemic. I know you're interested in the state support appropriations-wise that it takes to do our service. So our Carolinian and Piedmont services are state-supported with about $9 million a year in an annual appropriation from our state legislature. We do expect to see that ridership continue to climb with the addition of our 5th frequency this year. And we are working toward a goal of getting the service between Raleigh and Charlotte under 3 hours, which would make it car competitive, which we think will further grow our future ridership. On slide 5, you'll see how we're starting to think about growing our service beyond the traditional corridors that we have done. North Carolina is blessed to have rail corridors across our state. You'll see a number of corridors where we have expressed interest from the local communities in seeing passenger rail service. So we are submitting a number of these corridors to the Federal Rail Administration's Corridor ID program. This will unlock federal funds that do not require a local match that we can use to advance feasibility studies of these corridors for passenger rail. On slide 6, you'll see a little more of the Charlotte Gateway Station project that I mentioned. The partnerships involve the DOT doing the platforms and track work, which we have delivered on time and on budget. You're seeing the first train we brought in to that new platform, ensuring that all the clearances were appropriate. And the land you're looking at there yet undeveloped is where the P3 multi-use station will go. Right now, our train brings you to a part of the city that is not the urban core. Our station regularly floods, which is not good. It's way too small for the amount of passengers we have coming through it. So our rail division had the foresight a couple decades ago to buy this property in our Charlotte urban core, which we could never afford now, given what's happened to the price of real estate. And they've been waiting for the funding to enable us to build the station. And that funding has come about. So we're working in partnership with the city and the county toward that iconic multi-use station. On slide 7, you'll see one of our most exciting projects that we're currently working on. It's the S-Line project. So on the map on the right, you see a circle red dotted line. That is the S-Line currently owned by CSX. It runs from Raleigh up to Richmond. CSX's main line is the blue line that runs parallel to that. And so when working with our Class 1 partners to advance passenger rail on their system, we have to look for the win-wins. We have to find a reason to work together on something. And this corridor is particularly interesting for a win-win for a couple reasons. One is CSX's main line, that blue line, is where they want to grow their freight traffic. So there's not a lot of capacity to grow passenger rail on their main line. Another reason is because we love to follow our partners in Virginia. Hat tip to Mike. Sorry, I'm not there with you, Mike, but Virginia really knows how to do it well, and I'm sure he'll tell you more about the deal they did to purchase the S-Line on their side of the state line. So hand in hand, following their lead, we're in a negotiation with CSX to purchase our section of that line. This would enable us to grow our passenger rail on this corridor where CSX is running about 1 train a day, maybe 5 days a week, servicing freight customers. And the great thing about that win-win is we do freight as well at the DOT, freight rail in our rail division, and we want freight to grow as well. That S-Line touches 2 of our mega sites. We are hopeful that in this partnership, we can help CSX grow their freight business, while we also would have the chance to grow our passenger rail service. The other reason it's interesting is you can tell it's shorter than the distance if you went south to Selma and then north to the Northeast Corridor. We'll be able to cut an hour off the travel time between Raleigh and Richmond. And we all know when we build highways, we talk about cutting travel times in minutes. This is an hour on that trip we'll be able to cut off. So an incredible opportunity to grow our passenger rail service in a corridor that will connect the Northeast network and the Southeast network for the first time in a unique way. And you can see, as we all know, infrastructure projects take a long time. So we received this FRA designation for the Southeast Corridor in 1992. We then had to go through the environmental documents, and you can see those take an extremely long period of time, but we are so pleased that the folks who came before us did all that work and put us in the position to start to win the federal funds that have been flowing more recently for passenger rail. So you see things really took off in 2020 when we won the FRA CRISI grant to do the corridor purchase. Then we pursued an FTA transit-oriented development grant on behalf of the communities along the line and won that. And so now we're doing wrapping up transit-oriented development with those communities so that they are ready for rail and to make the most of it for their downtown. We partnered with VPRA to win another CRISI grant last year to do the surveying and preliminary engineering for the whole 160-mile corridor together. We have also put together and won another US DOT RAISE grant. So once we finished the TOD work, we knew we needed a site where we wanted to do future mobility hubs and start design. So we're not doing just rail stations, but we're doing mobility hubs where the entire trip can seamlessly be executed. So we've won that, and we'll be kicking that study off shortly. And we're already in conversations with the communities to look at what's the next pot of money we can pursue for them to build those stations. So what's really unique about this project is the partnership hand in hand with our local communities along the line, making sure that we're making the kinds of investments and decisions that support the way that they desire their communities to grow. On slide 8, you'll see a little more of what I was discussing earlier with the work that's been done along the corridor. I would note, as we always do for our consulting partners and construction partners, that when you do railroad work, you're also doing roadway work. So we'll also have 82 miles of roadway design and construction involved in this project. We are currently preparing a fiscal 22 federal state partnership grant application for the FRA opportunity. It's due March 7. We're doing it in partnership with our friends in Virginia. And this will take us, we're hoping, to our first leg of construction. Everyone knows that infrastructure takes too long, so we're pushing this one really hard and fast, and we're hopeful that we'll actually be turning shovels of dirt in the next few years. You asked us on slide 9 to touch on our keys to success. So I already mentioned our partnership. This is just a sampling of our partners in this project. And in the photo, you'll see we've convened the towns along the line repeatedly through our TOD work, asking them, what can we do to support you? They said, how can you help us plan for this? These are small rural communities that don't have the staff to understand how to plan and take advantage of passenger rail. So we've done a lot of work with our communities and bringing them consulting expertise to make sure that they've got their land use properly ready, their zoning properly ready, so they can enjoy the transit-oriented development that is walkable, that allows for vertical opportunity, that allows for P3 development, so that they can leverage this opportunity for all it can be. On slide 10, a little more on the transit-oriented development grants. This is, you can see the artwork on the right is from the town of Apex. So the consultants have been working specifically with each community along the line and helping them envision through art, through what the more dense development could look like. And so they have custom solutions developed for each of them that then their councils can take up and determine how they can better prepare for the coming service. On slide 11, you asked about how we staff our units. So you'll see this is a snapshot of a part of our DOT, our rail division director, our deputy director, and how they've organized their shop into 4 branches: planning and development, engineering, coordination and safety, design and construction, and then operations and facilities. We have approximately 80 rail professionals between our permanent staff and the consultants that are full-time for us. The key to this is being ready to take advantage when the federal government puts money on the street. So whether it was the American Rescue and Recovery Act, where we were able to secure $500 million to do our Piedmont Improvement Program, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and you saw how much money we're winning in those grants. Rail is the only non-formulaic federal transportation program. So every mode I'm responsible for and the highways have formulaic money that comes to them every year. Rail does not. You have to go win every rail dollar. And so in order to do that, you have to have a well-staffed, really good rail team in place. They have to be bringing projects through the planning stages so that they are ready when the grant comes forward. And they have to be proven successful with project delivery. We're really proud that $500 million Piedmont Improvement Program grant we received. We delivered that project on time and on budget. My team loves to talk about how we left $3. We could not figure out how to spend the last $3 of $500 million within the FRA's rules. We did try. We wanted to make it 0. We didn't want to leave $1 on the table, but we're pretty proud we only left $3 on the table. So that comes from growing a really robust professional staff that knows their program exceptionally well. So hopefully I've given you a high-level peek into how North Carolina has grown its passenger rail service, and happy to take questions at the appropriate time.
Ms. White?
Yes.
Will you be staying with us during the panel discussion? We generally take our questions at the end of when all the panelists have completed. Will you be staying with us?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, that'll be fine then. So if I can, I'll refer back to Mr. Belden and for our next speaker.
Next, we have Mike McLaughlin, the Chief Operating Officer with the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, Commission members. Thanks for having me here. On button, does that work? Okay. Failed already. Good morning. On behalf of our Executive Director, DJ Stadler, and our Chair, Jennifer DeBrule, thanks for having us here. Do want to know I love being in Tennessee. I don't tell people back in Virginia this, but I vacation every year at Norris Lake with the family. Love your lakes in Tennessee. Been coming to them for years.
If you don't mind, if no one from the committee objects, coincidentally, that happens to be in my district. So.
Love bringing economic Love bringing economic development, my 6 kids and my family and all their kids to you, to your district, sir. With that, I'm gonna, I have a PowerPoint. Yeah. Picture says 1,000 words, so if you just get to hear me speak only, that'd be boring. It is the, oops. Pretty sure it's this one. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go over these slides quickly. There are 20. I thought I'd present more information for you to read, and I'll briefly go over these. Make sure I'm doing this right. So we believe, Virginia, we're in the epicenter of rail in the east. And this slide is also to remind me, even though while I work for the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, freight is very important to us. The Port of Virginia, if you haven't been yet, is very impressive. Our Class 1 railroads have a significant presence there. And in fact, on the East Coast, the Port of Virginia moves more by rail, 34% than any other port in the East Coast. And there's a lot of rail programs in Virginia that help support that. A lot of the work we're doing helps supports that by separating passenger and freight, which we're going to get into. But they're massive, massive structures, and I'm sure folks in Virginia will be happy to have you tour that if you're ever interested. Next slide. These are our passenger routes. There are 4 state-supported Amtrak routes with 8 trains total. We actually had 6 until July, and we added 2 more, which I'll get into with our agreements with Norfolk Southern and CSX. A lot of them do go north-south. Because Washington, D.C., obviously, we have passenger rail up there with commuter rail called Virginia Railway Express. They have 8 round trips on the Manassas line. That Manassas line continues on all the way down to Roanoke, and then that's the Norfolk Southern line goes on to Bristol. But the V reroutes go to Manassas and they go to Fredericksburg. And you can see the round trips to Roanoke, Richmond, Newport News, and Norfolk. This slide is here to show you that the funding in Virginia has been bipartisan, whether it be Democratic governors, Republican legislatures, Democratic-led legislatures. Passenger rail in Virginia has been bipartisan. It has not been something that has been partisan at all. It is something that people have agreed upon. I think it helps that our reach is statewide, but also everyone understands the problems with road congestion. And one simple way, and that's what I'm getting to my next slide, I often ask people, have you ever been on 95 and not been stuck in congestion? 81, 66, our roads, and I'm sure Tennessee, you have a lot of the same problems. So people understand driving's great, but people want ability to take other modes if they want. So, and one of those modes has been rail, whether it be the commuter rail or passenger rail. So in the trying to figure out how to solve congestion problems in Northern Virginia is very difficult. Adding lanes of roadway will cost billions, if not tens of billions of dollars. So we decided to work with our freight railroads to determine, is there capacity to add more trains? And it took some time, but we worked with them. We worked them behind the scenes, not in the media spotlight. We went to them, like Julie said, with the win-win propositions, and we believe we got there, and we're moving forward on that. And I'll get into some of those details. So these are quick background. We did announce in December of 2019 a preliminary agreement with CSX to purchase quite a couple hundred miles of rail traffic and rail track, and more miles of rail corridor. And then we finalized that deal in March of 2021. There are some people in the room that helped us on those deals, and they'll tell you that long hours of negotiating, always in good faith, always in good faith. And while at the same time, we're also working on agreements with Norfolk Southern. So there's on 95 is a congestion issue, but also 66 and 81 are congestion issues, and our Roanoke route that goes to the southwest part of the state have been going gangbusters, to use an official term. People, there's only one route. People wanted another route, so we worked with Norfolk Southern to get one train, to get a second train on that route, and also extend the New River Valley where Virginia Tech is, and that's a growing area. We finalized that agreement with them in June of this past year. So at the same time we were announcing our agreement with CSX in late 2019, legislation was being put together that created the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority for various reasons. One reason being that we're going to be owning rail track. and that was for liability and other reasons. The folks that be in the Commonwealth decided it's best to have a rail authority. Also, we had some extra powers that some other agencies didn't have. And we were tasked with managing passenger rail. We were not allowed to operate passenger rail, though. We have to work with VRE, our commuter rail operator, and Amtrak. The legislation says we're not allowed to operate. So we work with them, we fund them, we work with them daily, but we're not allowed to operate. Our goals are to improve passenger rail, but to get there, we have to add more capacity. I'm going to get into that here in a few minutes. We do have a 15-member board, who is the chair is the Director of Department of Rail and Transportation, who is a appointee by the governor. We work really well with, we've had 2 chairs so far. We were really well with both of them. I mentioned earlier funding. The Commonwealth's had bipartisan funding initiatives. That was restructured in 2020 to create the Transportation Trust Fund and a Commonwealth Rail Fund. And you can see at the bottom, over 6 years, over $1 billion is coming to the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority. So while I said earlier that we had good faith negotiations with Norfolk Southern and CSX, it helped that we also had funding, frankly. It helped that we had funding to add capacity, because we didn't just want to we don't want to just force trains out on the freight railroad tracks and have them be stuck in traffic. Clearly, it doesn't make the Class 1s happy, but also wouldn't make our passengers happy. So we realized we needed to add capacity, and we're using this funding to add capacity, and I have some more details on that. I thought you might be interested in our uses and sources. It's not only that $1 billion, there's other sources as well, including, I can't help but mention the Amtrak source of $944 million. We had cobbled together about $3 billion before we went to Amtrak and said, we have a gap. And we went, I got to tell you, the folks, Stephen Gardner and the folks up at top at Amtrak, they were personally involved in negotiations with us. So if Tennessee's interested in talking to them, talk to the folks here, and their folks are vested in this. So they dedicated $944 million, which was the key last piece of funding. We have a separate agreement with them. We have agreement with CSX, agreement with Amtrak. Also, VRE put in $200 million of their own funds. That comes from some bond funds and some other funds of jurisdictions that fund VRE have. And we cobbled together other funds, including using toll funds. If you've been in the DC area, there's tollways, and they're actually expanding them. So we had some funding dedicated to them. Also, some funds that came from a multimodal fund that could have been used on roads, could have been used in aviation, but the governor and other folks decided a portion of it will be spent to good use on rail. So I'll go quick over the projects. The point of this slide is not to quiz you later, but there's a lot going on, and that's the point. This is the CSX agreement. I mentioned earlier we needed to add capacity, and that capacity, a lot of it, frankly, need to be added where trains currently are, and where we're going to put more trains. And that is the area where we have both Amtrak and VRE, and of course freight rail. That's what we call the RFMP. And that busy area is between Spotsylvania, where that's the end of the VRE commuter rail territory, and Washington, D.C. I should note that the biggest project, this is about $3.5 billion of projects you see in here, and this is broken into phases. I have a lot more information. I could speak for hours on this. We finished certain projects in phase 1, we get a couple more trains. We finish more projects in phase 2, we get a few more trains, both VRE and Amtrak. And it makes sense. You add more capacity, there's a little more room out there. So we think it's a win-win, because we're also, the end goal is to separate passenger and freight trains. And by getting passenger trains off the freight tracks, the freights can run more smoothly. That helps the Port of Virginia. That helps economic development throughout the Commonwealth. So the biggest project here is something called the Long Bridge. And here's the inset of the projects. The graphic on the right shows you some of the congestion issues. We have 2 tracks coming in from the Manassas line, 3 tracks coming in from the Fredericksburg line. They merge into 3 tracks, and then they go into 2 tracks over the Potomac. Just like with any roadway, you go from 5 to 3 to 2, you're going to have a traffic jam. So we had trouble adding more trains during rush hour, unless we were to build a new Long Bridge, an associated 4-track on both sides of the Potomac. And that's the centerpiece of our agreement with CSX. I should note, it also helps Norfolk Southern, helps Amtrak, helps VRE. All passenger trains in Virginia go over the Long Bridge. All long-distance trains, including the Carolinian that Amtrak runs, go over Long Bridge. So it's an important bridge. We've gotten some funding from the USDOT. We're trying to get more funding. Julie mentioned some funding programs. But the graphic on the right especially shows you the congestion issue and what we're trying to solve. There's a lot of other projects third and fourth track projects. They're also helping expand capacity, and they're actually the start, including these projects, of a dedicated third track all the way to Spotsylvania. So again, we'll have a dedicated passenger track all the way to the end of VRE territory, because that's where most of the congestion is. And this shows you these shows you the phase 1 and phase 2 that I mentioned earlier. Here's Long Bridge. It's actually not just a span over the Potomac. Just less than a mile of bridges and track in D.C., which is actually more complicated to build than the span over the Potomac, because you're dealing with national park land, you're dealing with urban development, dealing with roads such as 395 that always have cars in them. So I'm not saying the span over the Potomac is easy, but there's a lot more factors on the D.C. side. Again, I can't stress enough, we're enhancing capacity to expand service. Amtrak ridership is at all-time highs for state-supported trains in Virginia, even higher than it was before the pandemic. In 2019 was record highs. Every month since May, we've been breaking those record highs for state-supported service in Virginia. The highest ever was August. Traffic usually, ridership does dip a little bit after the summer months, but the highest September ever, highest October, highest October, November, and December ever was in state-supported routes. We did, again, we started with 6 state-supported trains, and in July, due to our agreements with CSX and Norfolk Southern, we had another train to Norfolk and another train to Roanoke, and people are taking them. You build it and they will come, is what we've seen in Virginia. And again, I can't stress enough, not only do we negotiate agreements with Norfolk Southern and CSX, we negotiated the time of the trains too. That takes quite a lot of time to make sure all the trains fit in, because all these trains, I should mention, go to the Northeast Corridor. They have to fit in with the Northeast Corridor plans as well. And because our folks, we have great city pairs between Richmond and New York, Richmond and Philly, Alexandria and Boston, so on and so forth. So people, they want to get out and about. Should also note that weekend ridership has been at all-time highs. Even if commuting patterns have changed, people want to get out. They want to travel for various reasons. So we're also working on more weekend service in VRE and nighttime service in VRE as well, because they see what the weekend ridership's doing for Amtrak. And VRE is just that, again, that commuter rail in the larger DC area. And they really want weekend and nighttime service because they don't have a train after 7 o'clock. And our agreements with CSX allow us to have that nighttime and weekend service. And I have to thank CSX and Norfolk Southern and Amtrak for being good partners over the years. Again, I touched on the Norfolk Southern agreement earlier, added a second train to Roanoke, which is one of the highest performing routes in the whole Amtrak network. We had the second train, and again, I use the term gangbusters. The ridership is going gangbusters again. We also want to extend to New River Valley, where Virginia Tech is. Again, it's a growing area. There's also Radford University is there as well. And we're going to put in some infrastructure improvements, and Norfolk Southern is also putting in some infrastructure improvements to make sure that train goes smoothly. Again, I don't want to put a train out there that people are going to take an hour and a half where they can drive 45 minutes. We want to make it competitive with the car. And as you can see, it's got 80,000 new rides once the extension to New River Valley happens. This is just one example of the benefits of adding more track. We had a congestion point just southwest of Manassas where there's a single track. Not single track both ways, single track in total. So adding a double track is really going to help. And not just our Roanoke trains. We have trains, like the long distance trains, the Crescent and the Cardinal that come up here as well. So this is helping the whole Amtrak network. And this is helping the freight network as well. So it's important to us that we have win-wins and I can show you slides on this along the RF&P, the Richmond to DC corridor as well. Julie mentioned earlier, you can tell we work closely with each other, we know each other well. The Richmond to Raleigh improvements, we believe it benefits the whole East Coast. She mentioned over an hour of travel time saved. We bought some abandoned rail track from CSX as part of our agreement with them. And we are already starting to move forward on design with some funding that she mentioned, the $58 million grant. And again, we also think that's going to help the freight rails because it'll free up getting some of our trains off their tracks. Opportunities for federal grants, I think we've all heard a lot about bipartisan infrastructure bill and IIJA. And we've already received a good amount of funding to date. Julie already mentioned the $58 million for Richmond to Raleigh, received $20 million. When we're building Long Bridge, we're also, as part of some mitigation, since we're harming some parkland, we're building a ped bike bridge, which actually got more comments in the EIS phase than the actual rail bridge did. People, again, it's a matter of giving people tools of how to get to where they want to go. You want to give them a whole diverse set of tools, not just one or two. So people, they'll get there many different ways, whatever they need to go. So with that, I'm happy to take questions once all the panelists are done.
Thank you very much. Mr. Belden?
And next we have Nicole Busich, Vice President for Network Development at Amtrak.
Good morning. I think we're just going to wait for the PowerPoint to come up. Here we go. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Mr. Chairman, Commission members, the TACIR team. It's great to meet everyone in person. We spend way too much time on Zoom meetings these days, so I really welcome these opportunities to be able to actually hand someone a business card.
I'm sorry, is your
oh.
mic on? It may just be not close enough.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me. So if we can go to the first, oh, I'm steering this ship here. Okay, so back in March of 2021, so this was prior to the passage of IIJA, Amtrak issued Connects Us, or Connects US, depends on who you're talking to, and that was our comprehensive plan to develop and expand our nation's passenger rail network. And this was Amtrak's 15-year vision to expand the system. And what that included is nearly 40 new routes across the country, serving 160 new communities that don't have passenger rail service today, and expanded and improved service for over 20 million more annual passengers. So this vision was a starting point, and this was before the passage of the IIJA funds. So this was really sort of setting the stage for the significant amount of funding that came to us through that bill. And we're excited to work with states and the FRA to advance these new corridors, and that's through FRA's Corridor Identification Program. So my team, Network Development, was created. It's a brand new team within Amtrak, and we were created to support and facilitate the development of these corridors throughout the country. And we've been coordinating very closely with folks in Tennessee and throughout the U.S. And I have here today from my team, Joe Barr, who is the Director of Network Development responsible for the eastern portion of the United States. Next slide. So FRA's Corridor ID program was established last May, and the applications for the first round are due on March 20th of this year. And once a corridor is selected under FRA's new program, the eligible entity will receive $500,000 in seed money. That's 0% local match, free money. That's unprecedented. The next phase is the service development plan. That's a 90% federal match. And then the next phase would be the preliminary engineering and NEPA, and that's an 80% federal match. And we now understand that the announcement for the selected corridors is going to be sometime later in 2023, so possibly fall timeframe, and that the second round of corridor ID applications are going to be pushed into 2024. So we, Amtrak staff, working closely with others throughout the country, we're continuing to encourage states and other eligible entities to participate in this first round. The application is not a heavy lift. You've heard all of these different grant opportunities and successes from Virginia and North Carolina, and it's not an easy process to get from that application phase to the dollars flowing. But this particular program is as good as it gets, especially for free money. So, with years of planning activities ahead, the timelines where it takes 20 plus years to get from the idea to the actual trains running, participating in this early round allows the states to have access to this first round of funding, these significant levels of funding. So the 2008 PREA Act, Section 209, governs how Amtrak supplies corridor service to the states. And the existing state-supported services are shown in this map with the green lines, and that includes services in both Virginia and North Carolina, folks represented on the panel today. We also have in the audience Jeff Mann, who's Amtrak's Senior Director for State-Supported Services. So when we get to specific questions, he can help me with some of the answers and responses. So the Infrastructure Act requires that we revise the Section 209 cost allocation policy. And last year, SAPRC, and that stands for the State Amtrak Intercity Passenger Rail Committee, SAPRC brought the states and Amtrak together and to develop a more standardized and consistent methodology for cost allocation and billing. And that 209 policy revision was approved late last year. TACIR, Mark and his staff have asked Amtrak to address a few specific topics during this. So I have a few slides I'll run through quickly, and then we can certainly sort of answer your questions later if you have specific things that you're looking for. But you asked us to talk about how state subsidies and ticket prices are set. So I'll move on to those slides. Here we go. Okay. So state-supported service subsidy is the state's responsibility to cover the difference between the operating costs and the revenue that is collected. And a state that is interested in starting state-supported service with Amtrak would begin by requesting that we do a detailed evaluation of the route, and that would include estimating ridership, revenue, operating costs, and the required state subsidy. Our financial analysis team has models built to be able to do these calculations, and they're now set up to account for the more recent 209 policy changes, and to highlight the recent policy shifts the cost of policing as well as insurance from the states to federal appropriations. So there's new sort of equation that goes into the calculation of the state subsidy. So this calculation can actually be done pretty early in the corridor development process. We don't have to wait until you're ready to run the trains. We've been working with states across the country to provide this kind of early look at what the potential subsidy would be in helping their decision-making for entering into the Corridor ID program. That's for the states like Tennessee who have not yet entered into the state-supported space. So additionally, FRA has, so it's listed here is the categories of 209 costs, includes third-party costs, direct route costs, shared costs, and if in that case, if there's an Amtrak long-distance service that's also traveling on that route, there's a shared component to that. There are additive costs as well as equipment capital charges. So FRA has something called the Rail Restoration and Enhancement Grant, R&E, and that can cover up to 6 years of operating costs for intercity service. And that's on a sliding scale. So you'll see here, starting in year 1, the federal government would cover up to 90% of that gap of the state subsidy, and then it pares down to year 6 where it goes down to 30%. And this program has been set up to, when you start a state-supported service, you do all these ridership models, and that's sort of a future year based on something theoretical. So this is a great opportunity for a state to be able to build that ridership demand. And the goal would be that after the 6 years, that ridership is strong enough that that gap between the operating cost and the revenue is getting smaller and smaller. So this is just a fantastic program that FRA has set up. And with Amtrak as the operator, FRA administers these grants through our annual grant appropriation. And I should note that there are states, as mentioned earlier, states like Virginia that have created a dedicated source of funding for passenger rail. And this can be a very good model for creating a sustainable service as compared to depending on yearly budget appropriations. So in terms of pricing and ticketing, the most important principle for pricing for state-supported services is that Amtrak will work with the state to develop a pricing approach and methodology that addresses your specific goals and objectives. We've created flexibility within our systems to support a number of different state strategies. So that could include a bias towards ridership, or a bias towards revenue, or a combination of the two. And it's very state-specific driven decision. And we're also open to working with the states, for example, to decide whether a train would be fully reserved or unreserved, or a combination of the two. So those are all things that, as you enter into new state-supported service, that we can work through with you. The Amtrak provides a relatively low-cost but robust ticket distribution solution. So customers can book the state-supported services through our call center, at the station itself, ticket machines, or via our digital channels online or the app. But we are able to keep this cost very low because nearly all of our bookings are done through our own systems, unlike other commercial modes that may rely on these third-party distribution systems where there's additional cost associated with that. So we are eager to partner with our existing state-supported services to help expand their services and add more frequencies, and work with states like Tennessee to create new routes. And there are many benefits to partnering with Amtrak. So since, and this is just a sprinkling of the benefits, of course you get Mike mentioned earlier about the support of our leadership, Stephen Gardner and Roger Harris. There is a very strong team supporting our decision-making, as well as a growing workforce, not just on the management level, but also the folks on the railroad. So firstly, since 1970, when we were created, we have statutory access to the national network. So that is something that comes with Amtrak service. You might have seen the recent press release about our new state-supported train sets. They're now called Aero. We used to call them intercity train sets, so it's hard for me to get used to saying Aero all the time. So these new train sets will start debuting in 2026, and partnering with Amtrak provides access to future option orders and the rail facilities associated with that. As I mentioned earlier, the R&E grants and that funding coming through Amtrak appropriations and grants. And we also have the ability to run demonstration trains, which is a really good way to build support for future service. So Amtrak, not only are we growing our staff, but also our technical deep bench of expertise and resources to support all aspects of the corridor ID process, from the early planning stage through to implementation. Just a few listed here, and we are happy to support the TACIR effort in any way that we can, and we've had some regular communication with Mark McAdoo to help advance your plans. And I'll finish by talking a little bit about our recent successes and service expansions. In 2022, we initiated new service and additional frequencies, including the Berkshire Flyer the Ethan Allen Burlington extension, and Mike mentioned the additional Virginia frequencies, Roanoke and Norfolk train in Virginia. And in 2023, in addition to restoring Adirondack service to Montreal and adding back another Cascades trip to Vancouver, we are also advancing an additional Piedmont train. Julie White mentioned that earlier. Great River service, that's a newly named route, Twin Cities, Milwaukee, Chicago. Additional frequencies on the Cascades route in the Northwest, and service along the Gulf Coast. So, this is the amount of planning that goes into from the desire to run more additional or different or new types of services takes a very long time. So the fact that all of these new and additional service has happened between 2023 and 2022 and upcoming in this calendar year, I think is a testament to the fact that we were doing this sort of prior to Corridor ID and all the funds that are available. And we're just excited about the opportunity moving forward with all of the resources that the administration has given us to advance and bring more trains to more people. Thank you.
And next we have Dan Palme, the Assistant Chief of Environment and Planning and the Director of Freight and Logistics at TDOT.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me fine? Okay. So first of all, I think I need to probably explain my role in the Department of Transportation and what actually I do and why I'm probably the best person to be on this panel. So, and I know several of your names, and it's good to see some familiar friends and faces. So first and foremost, I work in the environment of planning, which covers all planning, environmental work under Deputy Commissioner Preston Elliott. In my role, I'm over everything rail related, so it could be rail safety, it could be rail engineering, which is highway grade crossings, it could be the complaints from your constituents that are calling. So it's everything from abandonments, Mayor Frank, to all the different components that come, anything touching rail. That also covers the MATA trolleys, for example. We have compliance and oversight for the MATA trolleys and the CARTA incline. We also do the rail grant program for the short line railroads. We manage that, and I'm sure you all know, and a lot of my comments will be directed towards the fiscally constrained state that we're in, one of the few states that are debt-free. And in that case, we use rail transportation equity funds and distribute it to the short line railroads via the rail authorities. And then also, so that's kind of on the freight side when we're talking about rail, but I'm also interim director of the Multimodal Transportation Resource Division. And that covers all transit, and that covers bike ped issues in the state. So we're the compliance arm, Tennessee. I know you all know this, but we're very blessed in that we have transit in all 95 counties. So it truly is, my role is a balance of all those things, as well as local programs and some of the small community grants via TAP, MMAG. They're very popular in the state as we go forward. So I just kind of wanted to set the stage. In addition to that, we do the majority of the federal grants that we go for. So what we're always trying to do in the best interest of Tennessee is leverage those state dollars with the federal dollars and then get a grant and then get those projects through fruition to help all communities in Tennessee. So I think it's important too to say, well, where are we? Because I know a lot of times you all are busy and nobody really understands what's happening in the background of passenger rail conversations. So as Julie mentioned earlier with North Carolina, I'm on the Southeast. I'm the Commissioner Ely, or whichever commissioner that is in place. Typically, I am the proxy for him on the Southeast Corridor Coalition. It is almost every slide that you've seen. If you look at the previous slides, we're more of the Southeast, if you think of it, states. And so I'm the proxy on that. And we have a technical committee member and a proxy vote. And we meet, the technical committee typically meets once a month. The committee members are proxy. We meet about once a quarter, just to kind of let you know. I'm also, Commissioner Ely appointed me on, there's an FRA long-distance service study that has come out of all this. That meeting actually will take place Tuesday. It's a full-day meeting, got a very aggressive agenda, and I'm learning more as we go through it for how we can implement that in the state of Tennessee. So just kind of want to let you kind of set the stage of what we've done in Tennessee. So Mark with TACIR asked me, hey, let's talk about the pros and the cons of passenger rail in Tennessee. And I like to, instead of pros, let's talk about strengths. And then instead of cons, let's talk about opportunities and threats. So when we talk about the strengths, I think everybody, it's been very well between Virginia, North Carolina, and Amtrak has been very well. It's obviously about mobility choices. It's the opportunity. You can see a lot of the growth patterns that's increased ridership as we go forward. One thing, and I'm sure everybody probably realize it, we do have one train already operating in Tennessee. It's in West Tennessee. It's the city of New Orleans. Comes in one time per day from Chicago to New Orleans. And then the other thing is reduced congestion. We all know, we've done several reports, if you look at congestion in the state of Tennessee, almost all the congestion of the top 26 truck freight bottlenecks are all around our urban areas. You know, we have to address it, have to come out with a plan. And I know Commissioner Ely has talked to several of you on his ideas and the thoughts in the future of that. So let's talk a little bit about operational and threats, or opportunities and threats. So I think in all the slides that we've seen, the cost is one thing. As you know, Tennessee is a debt-free state. How do we come up with a program that's enough dollars and match that with the actual lanes that we want? I love that you all last year, you know, did TACIR and tasked them with this, because that's exactly what the department. It's up to your body to sit there and tell us what should we investigate, because there's going to be a cost associated with whatever lane that we do, whether it's inner city or whether it's run through. I think that's also in honesty when we watch and we look at some of the maps. As you can probably tell, if we took the whole brunt and bear and did whatever route we want to do from Nashville to Chattanooga, we have to have regional collaboration. And that's what I think of the beauty is, because I know all these people because we're already working together in the southeast of the United States, because it truly is about long haul to get those synergies that come with, whether you're going from Memphis to New Orleans or Carbondale or Chicago. It's all about those additional riderships that really help pay for this service going forward. I know Virginia did a study just last year that was tasked by their state legislature, and some of the costs were, I know Moffitt and Nickel, I think, did the study, and just the initial cost was $0.5 billion to $1.5 billion, with annual operating cost of $5 million, and then the revenue on it was $500,000 to $750,000. So those are some of the kind of costs that we're talking about. So bottom line is, I'd love for that, when the TACIR study's done, that you tell us really what to focus on, and then we can start doing some additional studies, some additional planning, coordinate it with the Southeast Corridor Coalition to really help Tennessee and where we want to put our dollars. I think it's also one of the things that we really need to study too is it's great that everybody said the same thing on the panel. You know, sometimes you get various opinions, but everybody talked about collaboration and working with the Class 1s, working with some commuter operators, working with the fellow states. I think that is the only way that long-haul passenger rail works, because you've got to have everybody at the table and go on the same page. And as you can see by some of the charts in the length of time, this is a long process. There's a lot more planning that needs to be done. There's a lot of things. I know there's a bill that's presented on maybe like Virginia's done with their authority that's running it. You know, I just love it because I think it's where we need to go and what we need to do. But with that, we really need to break down everything, and I'll give you a great example. We have to really work with the Class 1s to see, as you can tell with my hat on, my freight hat, in my multimodal, we're having like a blue oval transit study that was alluded to earlier. And this transit study is really looking at the beauty of Ford, and it's not released yet, and we're still going through it. But the logic was, think of it this way. It's basically trying to get passenger rail from Memphis to Jackson, and then with a stop at Blue Oval with a huge amount of workers. And this is just a snapshot of what opportunities there are. We have someone studying it right now. There's a lot of interesting tidbits with Ford, but they want 2 train schedules a day. But we also have to realize how that affects, in this case, the CSX that operates that train. And they've built up their infrastructure to handle the freight movement going to that facility. They're going to have parts for automobiles going in. They're going to have loaded automobiles going out, 2 totally different types of cars that have to maintain that. But then how does that fit in the passenger rail? Where would they stop at? Do they cross the highway there? There's a lot of things that need to be further evaluated, as you can probably tell. And that study should be coming out in the next couple of months. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then finally, I think I've covered all my major points. Look forward to question. The one thing, though, is sustainable funding. As you know, as I said, several of our programs are already built by funding mechanisms that pay for it. But then how do we go year to year, and then it affects the state budget going forward. So I look forward to any questions, and I will, if you want to meet me, I know that a lot of times you're probably going, wow, I didn't know Tennessee was doing that. If you ever want to meet with me, please reach out, and I'll definitely set up a meeting and talk to y'all.
Thank you very much. Representative Parkinson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, sir. In those numbers on the, I guess you were speaking to the ROI. I guess it was for Virginia. You said $500,000, $750,000. I guess, is that based on ticket sales only?
That was what was in the report, and Mike can probably speak more to it. I don't know.
Yeah, that was in the report. It was a very preliminary report done. We have some other routes that fare much, much better than that.
Okay, thank you. And follow up. Does that report also speak to additional revenues generated in tourism and other areas, the ripple effect of having these?
Without having it in front of me, I don't think it does. We have done some of those studies, though, for the Longbridge project, the one I mentioned over the Potomac. We did have George Mason University do a study of the economic benefits, which was billions of dollars a year. By that growth that's allowed, you're really unlocking that potential for growth. I think the study of the Bristol that he's mentioning, I don't think it had those numbers. We can double check, but I don't think it did.
Yeah, and just last comment, I think it's very important too, as part of the conversation, and maybe our friends from Amtrak can speak to this also, that we include the impact from other areas outside of ticket sales, because we can paint a gloom and doom story about ticket sales only, but when we know, all of us, I think, we got a ton of intelligent people, and the most intelligent people that serve on TACIR, to me, the impact from tourism, and as a matter of fact, the reason that I even brought this legislation was because I can see the vision for people that want to come to Tennessee, that want to experience all of the divisions of Tennessee. Blues and barbecue in Memphis, and country and music, and the CMAs in Nashville, and then get over into some possible Appalachia stuff, bluegrass stuff over in the Eastern Corridor. And so I think it's vitally important, and I'll task TACIR with this also, that we make sure we include the impact economically outside of just ticket sales with this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Senator Campbell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you guys for being here. This has been a really intriguing and exciting presentation. And boy, is Tennessee far behind here. I mean, wow. This is, an interesting and illuminating presentation. And quick question, I just would like to confirm that in Virginia and North Carolina, organizationally, these are set up under the DOT, right?
So in Virginia, no. We are separate. We are completely separate. Even our chair, she's the director of Department of Rail and Public Transportation, which is separate from Virginia DOT. The Secretary of Transportation, which is different from the Virginia Department there's a commissioner for Virginia Department of Transportation, handles the roads and also Section 130, grade crossing, and some other things. That is separate from the Department of Rail and Public Transportation, which does freight and I actually used to work there before we broke off VPRA, Virginia Passenger Rail Authority. There is a Secretary of Transportation that is we're under that Secretariat umbrella, even though I'm technically not, but since our chair is appointee, effectually we are, and all my board members are named by the governor. So I'll let Julie speak for herself, but I think I know the answer to her question.
Hey, Mike, it's Julie. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Senator Campbell, thanks for the question. Our rail division is under the North Carolina DOT, and we cover freight as well as passenger. So we do project delivery as well as planning. So for example, when there are highway projects by our Division of Highways, our rail division actually does the project delivery for the grade separations. So for us, it makes sense it all be under the DOT and reporting up. Also, because negotiating with railroads in Class 1s and short lines takes a level of expertise to do it well, our highway division passes all of those lead conversations over to our rail division, which we find our Class 1 partners really appreciate rather than trying to talk to 14 different highway engineers. And then I will say, we think it's part of our success with the pace at which we've been able to move, that we report to a singular secretary and a singular chain as opposed to a board. So pros and cons, I'm sure to both ways, but we've found ours to be a successful model in North Carolina.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had another question for Amtrak. So I represent Nashville. It's the largest, the third largest city without passenger rail in the country. So I'm just curious, how do we take the next steps to identify the most feasible and likely used routes?
Can you hear me? Thank you for the question. So I mentioned earlier about the FRA Corridor ID program. So prior to that, it was up to the individual state to start an analysis. And that analysis, the first main technical analysis is a service development plan. So in that effort, you would be looking at route, infrastructure needed, service plans, working with the freight railroads, developing cost estimates and ridership and all of that. That's when all of that upfront technical analysis happens. Now through Corridor ID, this was FRA's way to sort of create a unified program throughout the country to be able to funnel all of these infrastructure bill funds to develop these new corridors. I was just at a conference last week of mayors, U.S. Conference of Mayors in D.C., and Amit Bose, who's the Federal Railroad Administrator, spoke there, and he had some highlights of the priorities of what he wants to achieve at the end of the 5-year period. And he specifically mentioned 3 to 4 new corridors. And he also did mention the S-line for Julie's on the phone. So, so the point is that you kind of have to be in it to start advancing. The only way to start those service development plans is to apply to be part of the Corridor ID program. And as I mentioned earlier, the time frame, it's all new to all of us. It's new to Amtrak, it's new to FRA, it's new to the states. So we're kind of figuring our way as it goes along, but my understanding about the timing is that this first round, which the applications are due in March 20th, you know, even if you apply now and are successful, the money is not going to flow, you know, at least for another year, right? So you talked about being behind. You know, if you wait for the next round, it's just going to be another year. And it's all these initial planning exercises that are going to help you all and the state to make decisions about moving forward to the next step.
And can I just close it out? Okay, just to be clear, that's just that's 500,000 with no strings attached.
No strings attached, no string, and FRA expects that, so for example, for the Nashville-Atlanta corridor, and we also understand that there's an initiative to link Nashville, Chattanooga, Atlanta, all the way down to Savannah. The $500,000 seed money can be used by a state like yours to stand up an organization, right? So the money can be used for many different things. It can be used to help bring on staff or consultant support in the short term, to be able to advance, it's to write the scope for the service development plan and to start that work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Palmy, let me, just 2 or 3 quick questions. You mentioned Blue Oval City and that project over there in West Tennessee. Let me ask you, there's an interchange that was improved years ago that the joint venture Ford and SK Innovation are going to use to access the interstate. Mm-hmm. The number I saw regarding trucks per week from Ford Motor Company was 30,000 vehicles. There's a new interchange that's going to be built by TDOT below that, that's going to come into the mega site area south there. And that's going to connect to Highway 70 and dead end there, and it goes over into Fayette County. So there are going to be 2 interchanges, not just one. If you've ridden down Interstate 40 lately and you see the freight traffic that's already on it, what's the impact, or has TDOT looked at what the impact would be of that kind of additional freight on Interstate 40 at that location coming off of those 2 interchanges? Number one. Number two, the railroad spur that's going to go from the plant is going to connect to the CSX railroad. That railroad there is going to obviously have an increase in freight traffic. Does that eliminate CSX railroad as a possible passenger use between Memphis and Blue Oval City and or Jackson somewhat? And then I guess the third question is, that area and the state routes were never meant to handle this kind of traffic. And there, are you all doing a study now to see what roads in the future may need to be widened or additional lanes added, or what's TDOT's work on that?
Sure, great questions. Obviously, you know, Blue Oval happened quickly. They want to be up and running by January of 2025. So you asked a lot of great questions. The first and foremost, the actual design, all that is handled by the Engineering Bureau under Deputy Commissioner Will Reed. The particulars, I really don't know that much. The long-range planning, though, we're continually looking at studies and updating all the studies. I know that the Memphis MPO just had a big study that we actually helped them because they were specifically looking at the impact of that freight. It's in the comment period right now, and that should be finalized within the next 10 days or so. And that's the work of, it's called an Economic Regional Freight Flow Study. That was more looking at from the Shelby County to the site itself. As far as the CSX in particular, and I know we have representatives out in the audience on that, one of the big things when we start talking about service and we start talking about all these planning efforts is what's called an RTC model, rail traffic controller. Everybody's yelling at me what it is. And in this model, they will look at stuff, the impact of what type of freight trains that are scheduled in there and how you can potentially look at passenger rail service going back and forth. Because obviously that would help with the congestion. I think another point, as the governor and Commissioner Elia said, the Transportation Modernization Act, if we would have something like that to get us another lane going between, say, Haywood County or Jackson to Memphis, obviously I think it's the intent long-term of the department. We would love to 3-lane everywhere in the state. And there is going to be additional traffic. You are correct. There's a ton of freight traffic because I-40 is a major corridor going from east to west. So that's what the department's views are.
Yeah. On the roads, the local roads that are there, the state routes that are there, is TDOT doing a study now to take a look at the potential for having to
yes.
make some changes there?
Through the prioritization process, yes. Through the Jackson MPO, yes.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you guys for coming. I had a couple questions. I think we talked about ridership, as it relates to the formulary. Obviously, we have a little bit of experience in this with a short distance from Lebanon, Tennessee, which is 45 minutes that's 30 minutes east of here. And so it's kind of been interesting to see from one end to the other. I guess, do you look at how many, I think one of you stated 55,000 people were using. I guess the question that I have for surrounding that is, do you extrapolate how many people that is? Like, if I wrote it twice a day, is that 25,000 users, or is it based upon tickets? And how many of those people have you ever been able to extrapolate it down to how many of those people are buying a monthly fare or an annual fare? Just because I think for us, it's really difficult to understand financially what to do if we don't really have an understanding or a matrix of how many actual users we have. And as a state, how much money are we willing to put in knowing that this is a loser from day one as it relates to profitability? Because if we were doing that, and of course the state's not in the business of making money as it relates to providing services to our constituents, but there has to be something. So how do you measure actual users versus who those, whether it's a limited number of people or I don't know who's best to answer the question. You can all ask it. If you want.
I can start. So you're asking the question in the context of future service?
Right.
Right. So there are very, very similar to RTC, which is an operations model for freight and rail traffic.
Mm-hmm.
There are ridership models, very, very complex. We would take days to explain sort of the what goes into the black box. Very complex. It looks at the future, and it looks at future population and employment and development growth and all types of inputs. And you put in what you compare what is there today to the infrastructure that would be there in the future, and the model then tells you how many trips. It's usually measured by trips, one-way trips. So if you divide that number by 2, that's your riders, right?
Okay.
And so and you have to make some assumptions about fare structure and all of that, and it's planning for the future. It's not precise on the ground when you start an opening day. The numbers are not necessarily going to look like that. But the ridership models have become very sophisticated. There are plenty of examples where, there's some examples in New Jersey, the state that I live in, for new services that New Jersey Transit started running several years ago, where on day one, the service exceeded, this was for a commuter service, not Amtrak Intercity, exceeded the future forecast that the models create. So, there's back and forth. And, back to your profitability, Amtrak's Northeast Corridor is the only, correct me if I'm wrong, is the only service that we operate that operates at a profit. But we're talking pretty significant densities. And it was mentioned earlier about Amtrak ridership is now at or above pre-COVID levels at this point. We're not serving a commuter market. We're serving more of a leisure, longer business trip model. But as I mentioned in my presentation, what we've been doing in-house for states like Tennessee, we've done this for Ohio, for example, is to do exactly that, to do the ridership modeling. And some, there's some base assumptions that have to go into that about how many trains you'd be running and what the travel time would be and so on. But we did that for ConnexUs. The line from Nashville to Atlanta was in our original ConnexUs plan. So we have a foundation of information, and we can provide that to you.
Any idea how many people were riding one way from
I couldn't tell you exactly the number, but I'm happy to work with Mark and prepare a summary of that information and get that to this commission.
Yes.
Representative. Oh, sorry. You can go.
So just a couple quick points. You asked about, she covered some of the ridership issues. VRE uses weekly and monthly fares as a commuter rail operator. They were heavily reliant on the federal government, though. Over half of their riders were federal government, and they're not back to work. But if they go back to work, they'll be pretty slammed because the roads leading in DC are
As they should go back to work.
pretty congested. The mayor of DC has actually called for them to go back to work. With regard to ridership projections, they may be getting more sophisticated, but back when the Commonwealth was considering a state-supported route along was now called the Roanoke route, originally just went to Lynchburg. The first year ridership was supposed to be 33,000 people. It exceeded 100,000 people. And in 2019, and we'll beat that for this calendar year, we just, over 220,000 people rode that route. Now, we did extend to Roanoke, which is 45 minutes down the way, an hour down the way. But still, there might not always be the case, but in that case, it definitely is. When there are extensions or where people want stops in between, we do ridership modeling. We usually use some nationally renowned firms to do that and help us inform. And if it's low, we might not, that'll factor into it. That might not be the only factor because economic development, as Representative Parkinson said, is very important for these communities.
Before we go to the next, just a quick question. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, really? I thought this was a hearing. Okay.
I'll go on, finish your train, then your next question, then we'll go on.
Okay, Chairman. The distribution of those riders as it relates to plus or minus 5%, which are tourism related and which are commuter related?
We need to do surveys to do those kind of things. I don't have that data off the top of my head, but it's a mix of leisure. There's business too. There are people that will travel a couple hours for business meetings around the Commonwealth and up to DC. So it's a mix. Leisure, college students as well are very important as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chairman. And now we have Senator Yarborough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Palme, just a sort of quick informational question.
Yes.
So for the upcoming rail corridor ID program, are you aware of Tennessee entities that are going to be looking at that particular, making applications for the corridor ID program?
So we did submit an application for the corridor ID program. The one that Nicole mentioned about that's due in March, we're kind of waiting on the TACIR study results of that to see which corridor we should go after.
Okay. Well, yeah. So my real question, I think, is probably best addressed to Mr. McLaughlin, and just because the Commonwealth, and Ms. Smith, Chair White may all have things to add, but Virginia has gone through this much more recently. Can you help me understand how you dealt with issues of people wanting to use freight lines and trying to figure out how to balance and ensure that your freight and passenger services are distinct and both effective, and sort of just what knowledge base you had to get into state government that might not have been quite as prevalent before?
Well, I think it comes down to relationships with the freight railroad. Their freight information is proprietary. But once we got deep into negotiations and at a level of trust, we proposed some timetables and schedules that may or may not work, and they were honest with us because they don't want to see the freight and passenger rail conflict with each other. So it's a great question. It's probably hard to answer in just a few short seconds. But we had to work with the freight railroads to determine, because again, we made it very clear from the beginning, we did not want to force trains on there. There could be a process through a federal government entity to do so. We did not want to do that because it wouldn't end up being good for our passengers to be in congestion. Some of the infrastructure improvements that we suggested or they suggested, we jointly agreed upon them because we agreed to do them not just to help freight rail, but to help passenger rail. Again, people just want to know when they're going to get there. It doesn't have to be high-speed rail. If it's going to take 2 hours, they want to get there in 2 hours. So that was very important to us, on-time performance, and we have some agreements with them in our agreements as well regarding on-time performance. So I don't know if I answered your question directly, but it's a great question. Probably need a hearing on that alone. I don't know what the freight roads will be able to share, but again, working with them, having a good relationship with them was key to determining what freight they have out there and when, and how it may or may not conflict with passenger rail.
Mayor Frank?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions, and I'll just go ahead and throw them all out there in one bundle and let folks answer. And some may just be for TACIR to look at. Do we have an estimate of the cost per passenger compared to highway travel? And so what that cost would look like for the state of Tennessee? And then is there any data or metrics for actual reduction in congestion or, saving passenger time? Is there anything we can look at that? And then I understood what was said today from North Carolina in terms of subsidy, and I did some quick ciphering for a per passenger subsidy amount, but I do not understand, and I apologize, the Virginia model. I pulled your slides out, Mike, but I don't understand your funding model, if you wouldn't care to explain that a little bit.
Do you want me to start with that first, even though that
Sure.
was the last part? Yeah, I gave you the summary of the funding model. There was $1 billion in that one slide that the VPRA gets from all the different funding sources, the Transportation Trust Fund. There was another slide that showed a lot more money that came from other sources in the Commonwealth, and you might be referring to the second one. Basically, we had to work with other entities in the Commonwealth to tap some of the funding. So there's the pay-go, which includes the Transportation Trust Fund model, that money that comes to us on a yearly basis. Any legislature could change that, but it's not really dependent on. We don't need them to make any changes. It's in function year after year. We'll receive that money, and as the financial numbers change, revenues actually have been coming in pretty well. We receive a little more money. So that money, that $1 billion, wasn't static over that 6-year period. That had risen over the previous assumptions. Again, just much like one of your other panelists asked a good question. I'm not going to be able to probably answer it all right here. But we use the assortment of funding throughout the Commonwealth. And again, not just throughout the Commonwealth, but Amtrak contributed funding as well. But the base of what we're doing and the rail program that we had even before 2020 came from various taxes on that slide. And it's not up right now. But if you want me to show you. On this slide, there's the state revenues at the top that flow down to the Commonwealth Transportation Trust Fund. And then there's a Commonwealth Rail Fund that breaks off of that, and we receive 93% of that. So it's a flow down of funds. But that is a very important, even before we had our agreements with CSX and Norfolk Southern, we had funding from a lot of those same sources for something we call an IPROC program that helps some previous. We've had years and years of agreements with CSX and Norfolk Southern on one-offs. On one-off projects, we decided to do things more holistically. So the dedicated funding was important to Virginia. Even before 2020, we had funding dedicated to help fund passenger operations and fund capital projects. This was when we realized we're doing bigger negotiations with CSX and Norfolk Southern to look at it more holistically. The Commonwealth came up with even more funds. And not all of them were dedicated to rail. Some of them, again, as I mentioned earlier, were multimodal funds or toll road funds that could have been used in other sources that were used for passenger rail.
Mayor, I can maybe address some of your earlier questions about, you asked about some data points, cost per passenger versus highway travel, data for decreasing congestion, CO2 emissions reductions, passenger time savings. Those are all statistics that would need the level of analysis of a service development plan to answer. I'm not sure. I mean, you can look at other systems and you can look at comparables to try to get that information, but if you're asking for a specific line within new service within the state of Tennessee, using Nashville, Atlanta as an example, there's a robust planning and analysis that would need to be done to be able to answer those questions. And that's the whole point of planning. It's the steps by which you then can take that information and make decisions about whether it makes sense to invest in the service moving forward.
All right. I do have one question. We have some more people waiting, but whose responsibility is it to ask for this SDP? Would that be the State Department of Transportation?
No, so the process that we all need to follow at this point is FRA's corridor ID
All right.
process, and that's what I spoke about earlier. Applications are due on March 20th, and if you are accepted into the program, then that's when the money will start to flow for the seed money and then the money for the service development plan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And anyone that wants to answer this can answer this. Let me see how I wrote it. Give me 1 second, Joe. I've had coffee, so I was about to stumble over my question here. I heard you mention you mentioned growth in one of your previous answers. Is there a correlation between Amtrak passenger rail and growth within that state or within those cities?
Growth in terms of ridership or population and employment, is that what you were referring
Yes, ma'am.
to?
Mhm.
So what I was referring to earlier was the ridership models. So your local metropolitan planning organizations have sort of future projections for what population, employment, and so on would be in the future. And then for rail service, what we do then is we take that information and we estimate through these models how many people would potentially come to this new rail service. And a lot of times it's taking people out of other modes. In some cases, it's people who have never taken the trip before who would now take that trip because there is a rail service. So, you know, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I do want to go back, Representative Parkinson, to a question you had earlier about benefits and economic benefits. So as part of the service development plan process and certainly as a requirement for future funding for sort of the bigger ticket items once you get into design and construction for these new railroads, FRA requires a calculation of a benefit cost index, and a key input to that is the jobs that you're going to be creating, the cars that you're taking off the road, the potential growth in the cities. There's all of these sort of economic type benefits that go into that, and that's part of what they're looking for to be able to support the larger investment.
You have time for a follow-up? Yes.
One more.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that.
Yeah.
I know that you know, when they're determining bus routes in the city of Memphis through MATA, there's a growth model that's associated, directly correlated with where those bus routes are going. My last question is, in looking at your map. Oh, okay. And looking at your map, I was trying to figure out why or how we missed this whole corridor between Albuquerque and Nashville. There's just a void or a vacuum of a route there. Is there a reason why that we hadn't had that east-west, west-east?
So when Amtrak put together our Connexus plan, the vision, there was a lot of analysis that went into that. And if you look at, I didn't include it in the slide deck, but if you look at the rail network, the infrastructure that exists and the potential rail routes, it's endless throughout the country. You know, what we did as our first round of analysis for this vision is to look at the ones that seemed the most promising based on the city pairs. But what's changed since then, since our initial vision, is FRA's corridor ID process. And there are city pairs and states that have put expressions of interest for the corridor that were not on our map. And I'll quote our CEO, more trains for more people. If it wasn't on our map, that's okay. We're happy to work with you, to develop those new corridors moving forward.
Thank you for that. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you may have already answered this question. It's for Amtrak. The process to request a report of the ridership, revenue, operating costs, and state subsidy, and what is that time frame from the initial request until the report is completed, as a rough estimate?
It's my responsibility. It's all under my control. So you're asking the right person.
Okay.
And I would have to check with our team. We have many requests that are coming in throughout the country. It's not something we can turn around in a week, but certainly in perhaps 2 to 3 weeks we can produce. It's not a report. It's a fact sheet. It's a sort of one-page map and certain statistics that we're able to provide.
Okay. And what is the process for requesting that?
You just did.
Oh, thank you. Okay. All right. I've done my one job for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of course, Loudoun County, we have both CSX and Norfolk Southern running through our county, and kind of a follow-up on Reverend Parkinson's. As we see the development come in, I would like to see maybe TACIR do find some information on what the housing cost did as these areas became stops, especially for the moderate to low-income people that might have lived in that area. I agree again that from a tourism standpoint, I think this has incredible potential. I would love to see it go, be able to hit the big 3 divisions of our great state. I think its potential is unbelievable. But the Loudoun County and a lot of our rural counties throughout the state, I can speak for Loudoun County specifically, we're blue collar, we're retirees, and we're farmers. We've got about 10 to 15% maybe to have white collar participation or white collar occupations. And most of them are traveling out of Loudoun, not all. But we're already talking about a shortfall on maintenance due to the electric cars. I would like to see maybe some information. I don't even know if it would probably be a while for it to even be available on the gas tax collections we have for maintenance of our infrastructure. If we take even more cars off the road, I think that's great. Tennessee does have plenty of traffic, no doubt about it. But the impact that would have on being able to maintain our current infrastructure, maybe that's a TACIR deal because, like I said, a lot of folks in our rural counties, they're not going to have the benefit of the rail. Again, I'm not against it 100% by no means, but I think there's a lot to be balanced out as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Additional questions? Okay. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am, Madam Clerk.
You may have already mentioned it, but how many states are currently partnering with Amtrak with the state supported services? How many total states?
19.
Is that it? Are there other questions? I have just 1 or 2. I wanted to wait till the end, let everybody else have their chance. But and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing the name, Miss Bush. Am I close?
Close. Busich.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
All right.
You did better than most.
Well, sometimes people mangle Jaeger too, so. In your comments, you mentioned a Nashville to Chattanooga to Savannah line, which caught my interest. But then on Miss White's maps, I saw a dotted line, which I think reflected a line from Chattanooga to Atlanta, but from Chattanooga to Nashville, there was no indication of a line. So can either you or Miss White jump in and explain this, reconcile this to me so I'll have a good understanding?
So I will
Because
say,
I think
sure.
you obviously, when you started talking about parts of East Tennessee, you got my attention.
Okay.
And Nashville.
So as part of the FRA Corridor ID program, since
What corridor? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
no,
But that's
sorry.
my fault,
Is
not
that-
yours.
No, is that better?
Oh, much.
Okay. So as part of the FRA Corridor ID program, which was initiated back in May, they asked eligible entities for an expression of interest. So that was throwing your hat in the ring. This is a potential corridor that we would like to study and learn more about. Back in, I think, December, perhaps, a letter from the mayors from Nashville, Chattanooga, Atlanta, and Savannah, they submitted an expression of interest for this larger corridor. So as far as we understand that there is some thought that the mayors may be leading an application for that larger corridor. We do know that Georgia DOT is putting in an application for the Atlanta to Savannah piece. So this is a little bit overlapping. But as I said earlier, it's throwing your hat in a ring. It's putting together a 15-page application for free money. So it's a pretty easy lift. So that's where that bigger linkage came from. I'm not sure Julie's slide, whether that would have, I won't speak for her, and I'm not sure if she's still on the phone, but would have necessarily covered,
Yes.
the expansion. Yes, we can hear you.
From the Southeast Rail Commission's report we did last year, where the states worked together to identify what we saw as the backbone of the Southeast Network. So it may have been a timing issue as well, to Nicole's point.
I can't see it. All right, thank you very much. And I'm not sure who this question is for, but we'll start with TDOT. Always a good place to start, I think.
Thank you.
But I made an observation, particularly when I heard the very excellent presentations from North Carolina and Virginia, that most of those lines were north-south lines that connected, that ran through the megapolis along the eastern coast on up into to New York City and beyond. But in Tennessee, we do have, depending on how you count, 4 or 5 very large cities. One in the center, of course, but the others really on the periphery of the state. But they're separated with vast expanse of very rural, low-density areas. So while I agree with the potential and everything it said, with that, how do you make this work?
Well, it's really about numbers driven. I think when you start to look at it, 55,000 ridership, that's a great number if you're talking about. And so, if you break down a longer route like Chicago to New Orleans, anybody can get on that all the way up at the various stops that it does, and that's where you get the benefit, Chairman. In the case of if you're just talking Memphis to Nashville, there is no convenient opportunity to go. If you were in Chicago and you wanted to go to Nashville, you would have to go take the city of New Orleans, and if we eventually get service. So you really have to plan accordingly, and that's no different if you're I know a lot of tourists that come in internationally. That's exactly what they do. They're not in any hurry, and they'll just take Amtrak all around the United States. The interesting thing about Tennessee is if you're in D.C. and you want to go to Atlanta, it just doesn't go through Tennessee. There is an option there. So if we're going to the direct line, yeah, it should be in Tennessee, right? But there is an option today that you could do it in long haul passenger rail.
All right. Thank you. Representative Love, did you have another question, sir?
I just want to get some clarity on which route I requested the study on.
I was gonna ask you that question after. But so the one route that I can promise to deliver is the Nashville to Atlanta route, because that is the only one that was actually analyzed as part of our Connexus.
Okay.
In terms of the other potential routes, that's something that would take some time. I would say probably later this spring we can work on those.
And that can be done without the corridor ID grant, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Are there other questions? Yes, sir, Mr. Clifton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My question goes right in line with the urban-rural standpoint. In looking at the 209 subsidy works, the numbers you presented referred to urban areas. How would that relate to the rural nature of most of Tennessee? Would that change the subsidy as far as the timeline or the percentages?
Are you talking about the R&E grant, the Restoration and Enhancement Grant?
Yes.
Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
I don't think that there's any specific connection between FRA's grant, awarding those grants, whether it's rural or not. I think it's to get to the point that you are requesting an R&E grant means you've gone through every step of this process, the planning steps, the design, the construction. You know, you're nearly there to service running. And if you've gone through all of those steps with FRA as a partner and have been successful in receiving funds for all those previous steps, FRA is on board as a promising corridor, right? So moving into the R&E grant process would sort of be another stepping stone.
Thank you. Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, and I'm happy to see so much interest in this. I think it's good. I got a quick question though, and it'll be for I think Amtrak can answer this. So, is it still the Spirit of St. Louis that's running up and down that 55 corridor from Chicago to New Orleans, or is it a different train name?
City of New Orleans.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. So, and I've ridden that train several times, but that makes stops in rural areas. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, my colleague Joe Barr just corrected me, Mr. Clifton. So there is a criteria that FRA uses to give preference to serving underserved and rural areas. So that is a benefit for new services. So if that answers that question, does that answer your question?
That does answer my question, but can you just what's the benefit of having a stop in a rural area? I know they're pretty obvious, but I want you to say it on the record.
If you build it, they will come. It's providing service to people who do not have service today, right? So it's the balance between profitability and providing a service, and that's a decision that would have to be made going forward.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Director Lippert, you're recognized.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to assure staff, we have a kind of a short list of routes that we've been looking at as we've done this study, and we'll be providing that list to our friends from Amtrak. But the Nashville to Atlanta one, of course, but Mark McAdoo will be getting with you with ones we would like, whatever information you can share on, because that would obviously help our study as well. And then I just needed a clarification question on the hats in the ring aspect of this. So TDOT, of course, did submit a letter of interest for the state of Tennessee, but of course they have not yet identified any potential routes. They're waiting on our study for that. So is our hat in the ring, or will our hat not be in the ring until we actually say these are the routes we're interested in?
The expression of interest was giving FRA a heads up that you will potentially be applying for this round. And it allowed FRA to have direct conversations with states to understand sort of what their intentions are for the application process. The true hat in the ring and getting in the ring is this application that's due on March 20th.
Thank you.
Are there other questions for our panelists? I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Mr. Belden for assembling this panel. This has been an outstanding group. We really appreciate your very significant input. I want to compliment each of you on this. And I want to thank the members for their questions and their patience with me as I tried to make sure everybody got heard. Are there any other questions? Then I believe the next item is other business, and I will is there any other business? Director Lippert, do you have any other business to bring?
Mr. Chairman, we have, I guess, two things. One is the next meeting date, and of course, we can poll the members. We will be looking at dates most likely in June after the end of the session. And then there was That's all for other business.
Are there any other comments or questions before we depart? There's been a motion, no seconds needed. We'll stand in adjournment. Thank you.
I'm here to help, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, get us going. No, you just want to hear my closing speech.